English step by step, how to use a and the. Step 1. Let's start by looking at the. When do we use the in a sentence? The is the definite article. So here we're talking about definite things. We use the when we are talking about something unique. Examples: the sun, the internet, the Olympic Games, the president, the theory. Now normally these things are unique. Let's look at the sentences. The sun rises in the east. There is only one sun for our planet, so we have to use the. The sun rises in the east. The internet is a complex system. Now, if you're talking about one big system, it's unique, so it's the internet. The Olympic Games. Now, there is only one organized games called the Olympic Games, so we have to say the Olympic Games. The president. The president gave an important speech. Now, normally we know which president we're talking about. In this case, it's a unique president. The president gave an important speech. The theory. If you're talking about a theory, normally there is only one theory you're talking about. For example, the theory of evolution. Who created the theory of evolution? So there you have 5 examples of unique things in which we use the. So let's look at some more contexts in which we use the. We use the when the context makes it clear what we are talking about. For example, we stayed in a cheap hotel. The room was small and the bed was uncomfortable. Well, what room are you talking about? You're talking about the room in the cheap hotel. What bed are you talking about? Well, you're talking about the bed in the cheap hotel. So in this case, we use the room because we know what we're talking about, and the bed because we know which bed we're talking about. Next example. We sat down, called the waiter, and asked to see the menu. Well, in this context, we're talking about one waiter and we're talking about one menu. So, if we're talking about a restaurant, we know that we're not talking about any waiter, we're talking about the waiter in the restaurant and the menu in the restaurant. Next example. We arrived at the top of the hill and admired the view of the city. Well, in this case, we know what view we're talking about and we know what city we're talking about. We're talking about the view and the city from the top of the hill. So we say the view and the city. Next example. We stayed in a hotel in the city centre. The hotel was quite expensive. Now in this case, we know what hotel we're talking about because we mentioned it in the previous sentence. So it's the hotel. Next example. While I was driving, a lot of insects hit the windscreen. Now, we're talking about a specific windscreen. We're talking about the windscreen in this story. So it's the for a specific windscreen in this context. I was driving, a lot of insects hit the windscreen. Now, we use the for things which we have mentioned previously. The listener knows what we are talking about, so we use the. Examples. I saw a dog chasing a cat. The dog had a bone in its mouth. Now you can see in the first sentence you use a because you've mentioned it for the first time. In the second sentence you use the because you're talking about something you mentioned previously. The dog had a bone in its mouth. Number 2. She had an old car. The car kept breaking down. Again, the car, because you've mentioned the car previously. Next example. There was a storm during the night. The storm destroyed several buildings. Well, in the second sentence, you're talking about the storm you mentioned in the first sentence. We stayed in a hotel in the city centre. The hotel was quite expensive. Well, the hotel is the hotel you mentioned in the first sentence. We had new neighbours. The neighbours were very friendly. So in this example, it's plural. The neighbours. What neighbours? The neighbours you talked about in the first sentence. We also use the for superlatives. Now this is because superlatives are also unique. Examples. It is one of the longest rivers in the world. So here we have the longest rivers. Longest is the superlative, and this river is unique. Next one. She is one of the most interesting people I've ever met. So most interesting is superlative. The most interesting is the reference to the people. The most interesting people I've ever met. One of the most interesting people I've ever met. That's the worst film I've ever seen. There can only be one film which is the worst, so this is again the with superlative. What is the least expensive restaurant in the area? So again, least is talking about something unique. The least expensive restaurant. There is only one. He's the fastest runner in the team. There is only one person who can be the fastest runner, so again we use the fastest runner. In English, we also use the for a class or a category of things. For example, the invention of the camera changed the way we see things. Now this doesn't mean one camera, it means one invention. The invention of the camera. Next example. Cities were quieter before the car was invented. Again, we're not talking about one car, we're talking about one type of invention. Next example. This organization is trying to protect the panda and other endangered species. Now here, again, we're not talking about one panda, we're talking about one species, which is the panda. Last example. The use of the submarine changed the course of the war. Now, of course, during the Second World War, there were hundreds, maybe thousands of submarines. But here, we're not talking about one submarine, we're talking about one category of, in this case, it's one invention which was used in the war. The submarine. We also use the for social groups and national groups. For example, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So there we have the rich and the poor as two social groups. Next example. The organization gives help to the unemployed. So the unemployed is a group of people in a society. The book looks into the relationship between the English and the Irish. Well, here you have two examples of national groups, the English and the Irish. The next example is similar. Many of the French joined the resistance, and that means the French people. That's a national group. So now let's look at a summary of all the contexts in which we use the definite article the. Example number 1. The sun rises in the east. Well, in this case, we're talking about something unique, the sun. Normally, there is only one sun we're talking about, so that's unique. Next one. We arrived at the top of the hill and admired the view of the city. Well, we say the view and the city because the listener knows what view you're talking about and knows which city you're talking about. So, the context gives you the information. So the context is talking about one view and one city. Next example. She had an old car. The car kept breaking down. Well, you can see in the first sentence it's an old car, and in the second sentence we know which car the speaker is talking about. So in this case it's previously mentioned. It's mentioned in the first sentence. Next example. It is one of the longest rivers in the world. Well, here we have longest, and that's superlative, so we must use the. We always use the in superlatives. Next example. The invention of the camera changed the way we see things. Well, in this case, we're talking about a category of thing. We're not talking about one particular camera. We're talking about a category. Next one. The organization gives help to the unemployed. Well, in this case, we're talking about a social group, which is the unemployed. So, a social group, the unemployed. So that brings us to the end of this step 1 video on how to use a and the. Move on to the step 2 video in which you'll find a practice exercise. And please, if you like the content of this video, please click like and you can subscribe and you can request a lesson below.